Hello, everybody out there. This is Colonel Gallagher to my NMMI cadets and students, and to anybody else who wants to listen out there. I appreciate the feedback, by the way. I do get it. I post it to Facebook as well. This is where I get the majority of the feedback. And tonight, courtesy of being very tired after a long day, I'm going to try to put the third installment in the American Revolution. And I guess I could start with a quote, and I will, because this is about the Constitution. A great question is why? Why the Constitution? And a quote I like from an American minister, and I don't know the name from this time period, stated this: power abused ceases to be lawful authority and degenerates into tyranny. Liberty abused or carried to excess ends up as licentiousness. Okay, now why start with that quote with this minister? The word tyranny is the key I want you to focus on. The American Revolution, if you can imagine this as a flow chart, the American Revolution purpose, very succinctly, very easy, was to resist tyranny. And in trying to resist tyranny, the Americans, the government, believed they had done the best, these founding fathers, by placing the power, if we deposited it, if you remember the piggy bank, the ladybug piggy bank, with the people. The sovereignty, the right to rule, then sat with the people. And in doing so, there's a couple things we have to think about before we move to the next part of the flow chart. And here it is. We take it for granted, and this is one of the biggest problems of studying history and studying especially the Constitution. We take for granted, oh, it must have happened, it had to happen. And one person who I've read a lot on, Timothy Snyder, has this incredible line. He says, history is not repetitive, but it is instructive. And I think that's true. We almost perceive that this must happen, and this is absolutely false. The inevitability of history is a very dangerous game because people make decisions. And in this case, the American population, the American leadership made the decision to deposit that power with the people. And why I'm saying this is if you think of that context, that time period, what else did you have that was a democracy? What else did you have that was a republic? And you could look back at Rome, and you look back at Greece, and the one thing I would say about these gentlemen, they were very good historians. And even when you look at that, one of the other great quotes was by a guy named James Wilson, who was a member of this founding fathers generation out of Pennsylvania. Wilson, you don't hear about his name much. He's very important, though. And he said, "You've heard of Sparta, you've heard of Athens, you've heard of Rome, and you've read their constitutions, but now look at our Constitution, the American Constitution." What you have to remember is even with Athens and Rome and so on, what the Constitution ended up being is ratified, approved by the American people. And this was a unique process then. And that's the only way to understand, I think, this Constitution as a process. So let's go back. The Americans avoid tyranny is the number one thing. And why I start with that quote and tyranny is there becomes an amazing question as we move into the Articles of Confederation. And the real concern in the Articles of Confederation by people like James Madison, who's one of the most important people in this whole thing, had to be this idea that they were shocked by what was going on in the states. The power had really been placed in the states. It was 13 independent places. What you had was, as you put this power into the states, therefore you had denied certain powers to the central government. This central government that had been created was denied two very specific powers. These are the two we need to focus on. The first is the idea of taxation, the direct taxes. This is the collection of funds and money. But the second one that is really fun to read about, I think, but sounds dull, is the tariff. Now, when you look at the tariff, the one reason I think that's important to center on is therefore, when you look at the tariff, you see nothing but this perfect disunity, this massive independence of the states, and really the feebleness, the weakness of the central government. And a tariff is simply a tax on imported goods. And if you take and follow that road, the states themselves increased their tariffs between each other. In other words, if I'm in the state of Pennsylvania and I want to sell my goods in Maryland, I would have to pay a tax. they're operating absolutely as independent places. They constantly are referred to as another Europe. This is all we've created, is another Europe. All these little independent states. And if you take the tariff a little bit further, as far as dealing on a global trade basis, this is not a good idea. The tariff would allow, if you allowed central government to operate this way, to have a guaranteed revenue, and then on a global basis be able to operate against people like Britain and operate on an equal footing. In other words, Britain could come in and kind of negotiate with each state, and this would be a divide and conquer, economically speaking. So these concerns are there on a large scale, but on a local scale, that tyranny I was mentioning, James Madison, but others were witnessing this in the states. There was too much democracy. We go to that second part of the quote, too much liberty. And the democracies were beginning to form in these smaller areas, the states, worried Madison, especially, that the people getting in these local governments were not working for the best interests of the people. They were working as a majoritarian tyranny. Okay, think of the word majority. This is a group, okay, of folks that are working for their own interest and working under the design of a false democracy, therefore. It's maybe the people weren't the right place to place it in such a direct manner. And the results, the best example was Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. Shays' Rebellion in 1786 absolutely shook the Americans to their core, especially Washington, Madison, Hamilton, and a guy you may never hear much about, Henry Knox, who had served in the American Revolution, General Henry Knox of Washington, who would later on become the first Secretary of War. And Knox wrote about this. And it disturbed them because Daniel Shays was the leader of this rebellion in Massachusetts. He's a farmer. The farmers are these soldiers who haven't been paid. There's that issue again. And because of this, the state of Massachusetts needed to be revised in some way because the government in Massachusetts was being controlled by this elite group of people, this majoritarian tyranny, so to speak. And when you start looking at this, the Articles of Confederation, which actually accomplished quite a bit, let me be honest with you, when you really start reading about them, became this idea of maybe there's too much power in the states, there's too much individuality, and there needed to be a greater sense of unity. So Madison, and I keep mentioning his name because especially with the ideas of these Virginians, are going to conjure up this thing called the Virginia Plan in response to these problems. In other words, the states, 12 of them except one, Rhode Island, decided to send delegates to Philadelphia. This is the famous May to September, okay, convention known as the Constitutional Convention. But these gentlemen who showed up, especially the Virginians, who laid out the floor plan, as I call it, by submitting the Virginia plan, is going to argue that the articles need serious revision and most likely even an alteration completely. It's kind of a makeover, if you want to call it that today, a documental makeover, and they're going to conjure up a stronger government. Now, when you get in the Constitution, there's three C's. I call them the three C's since it starts with the letter C. The first thing is the character. And the reason I say the character is the Constitution, does it reflect the character of the American Revolution becomes the first question when you analyze the creation of it, the form that it took. The first line in that Constitution is very important. We the people. And the other line is even just as important. Do ordain. The book to get is America's Constitution by Akil Reed Amar. This is one of the best I've ever read because in his very first piece, he gives a wonderful, wonderful introduction that I wish I had said. It started with a bang, and he mentions ordinary citizens would govern themselves across a continent and over the centuries under rules that the populace would ratify and could revise. Now, if you go down, he's reminding us that in the middle of this period of time, the Americans are doing something unique. There's kings and queens and the old world hereditary elite. The Americans are rejecting and venturing into this absolutely new design. That's the beauty of it. The character of the revolution, the ideas, of natural rights, the ideas that men can govern themselves, the ideas and notions of equality are written throughout it, and the hope is there. And later on, he mentions these words, we, the people, but then he skips it to we do, as if marriage vows. I love it. It's fantastic. And so out of this becomes this hope for unity. Did it reflect the character of the revolution is the first question when you look at the Constitution and the construct of it, okay? The second C is control. You're going to shift control. And I always tell my students it's kind of like the law of thermodynamics when I always look at political power. It never really dissipates or disappears, it merely takes new forms, it shifts. And what happens is you're going to take certain powers from the states, two very important ones. One, states for printing their own money. This is not good. And you're going to bring that in, rein that in, and that's a control shift. Okay, the states no longer doing this now. The central government. And then the other thing that you're going to take away and deny the states was, once again, the tariff. States had their own independent tariffs. Remember this. You're going to get rid of that. And so now there's that centralization. It's a control. It's the center getting it. And what you want to really pick out as you start moving into this control, which seems like a weird contradiction, is that it's this fear underlying that control, that shift back, is a fear of the tyranny, the majoritarian tyranny. And here we go. Here's Madison at his best. And if you read the Federalist Papers, they weren't in a book back then, but thank goodness they put it in a book for us now. Federalist number 10 and Federalist number 51 are the two predominant Federalists written by Madison. And Madison simply is going to say something. He says, look, republics people think should be small and they're safer. He's saying this is false. We're watching this, and keeping it in these small states is creating greater problems. This majoritarian tyranny is emerging. If you spread it out, if you make it a larger republic, then you have these competing interests, these competing factions, and it's a safeguard to the population. What's amazing when you read these guys, the word safeguard comes up all the time. And so it is not trying to deny the people or the states. That's kind of a misinterpretation. Okay? It is about a shift in that power of a necessity to create a unity and a common identity in some sense. But it is in the way of that fear of the excess, licentiousness of the liberty in the states. Okay, now the last C for me is compromises. There's no other clear way to explain and describe the Constitution, the creation of a bundle of compromises. And I love that word. There is a consensus that went on. As those folks met in Philadelphia now, the first thing is they went into the convention, you had a group that were very uneasy about what was going to happen and under the impression simply that the articles are going to be amended. Once they got in there, they realized, oh my gosh, this is something new because bam, here comes the Virginia plan. And Madison, who had thought this ahead very carefully, basically said we got to strengthen the national at the expense of the state. And as we do this, we're going to recreate this central government. Oh, this isn't good. If you can imagine being yourself in this period of time who had fought for this character of the revolution, it seemed like there was this conspiracy afoot. And so men left. These are our founding fathers just as much. I always believe these become known as the anti-federalists. Okay, the federalist simply means somebody who supports the Constitution. It's a brilliant term. It's what's in a name, as our Shakespeare would say. Everything is in a name. I mean, don't you love it when somebody says, I'm going to open a company, I call it quality, or I call it, professional is the first name you see. What's in a name? Everything's in a name. And the bottom line is they should have been called nationalists. Don't choose that name, right? People owe suspicion. So what's in a name? Everything. And so what you find out, these bundle of compromises begin in that room. Even though these gentlemen that walked out become known anti-federalists, okay, they don't support the Constitution. Federalists are those who support the Constitution and need for a greater union. Madison, Hamilton, Washington, these folks, John Jay, okay. Still, nonetheless, there's these bundle of compromises. The first compromise, the most important, is called the Great Compromise. It's a lot of times alluded to as the Connecticut Compromise. The biggest issue in the question was the one thing we've been talking about, or we've gotten over the American Revolution, the word representation. It's the word I love the most. Because representation, to me, when you look at this, meant a lot. It meant that the people would have a voice. And they didn't forget this with the tyranny of the British. And now the tyranny was going to be transferred, so to speak, I guess. But the reality here, because in other words, what I'm getting at is the Continental Congress was really supposed to be the replacement for the British Crown, and even the British warned John Adams and some of these others, look, you're just replacing tyranny. And Adams said, this is poppycock, can't be. There's no such thing. It's a contradiction in terms, a democratic despotism, right? Madison and Adams later on said, oh my gosh, it's become one. So anyway, we need to rein that in. And so now what happens, these bundle of compromises, the Great Compromise has to do with representation. Because here it is. How are the people to be represented in this new government, the central government? If it's by equal, meaning each state got the same amount, one vote per state, the problem, Madison said, is simple. You have a larger population in these different places, like Virginia's a big state, New York's a big state. This is an underrepresentation. This is not accurate because you're talking about a numbers game, big versus small. So the two plans, Virginia plan, New Jersey plan, are both there. Virginia plan calls for a large states plan. We want it based on population. The representation's population. New Jersey plan countered that, must be equal. Voila. Eventually, I'm cutting to the chase, the Great Compromise. You're going to have a two-house legislature, which Madison wanted initially. Dr. Farley knows, and he corrected me. Thank you. And what happened was you're going to have an upper house and a lower house. Now, the lower house is the House of Representatives, which would be by population. That house would be, here it is, directly elected. Aha. Therefore, the House of Representatives would have the power of direct taxation. Article 1, Section 8 tells you all about it in the Constitution. This is the great creation. The upper house, the Senate, would not be elected directly, not initially. Things will change, and that's the beauty of another word. And what happens is, as this went on, most of the national government, only the House of Representatives was elected directly. The Senate, no. The President, the Electoral College, no, not directly elected. And the last thing is the Supreme Court. 3 of the 4 parts would be appointed, basically, or an indirect election. It's a republic. And so in doing so, it is reining in these excesses, creating a filtering system. Was it still the people? Yes, for 3 huge reasons. 1, the people still choose. A republic is I choose and someone decides for me. So how does that senator get there? I choose someone in my state legislature, and out of that, they decide who goes into the Senate. It's still the people are involved. It still rests on the people. Only indirectly, though. 2, so it's a filtration reining in from that excesses. Maybe the people don't know how to govern themselves, but we will still place the power with them. 2, when you talk about with the people, is even after the Constitution was written, it had to be ratified, approved by the states. Even the articles didn't undergo such a process. And in 3 of the states, but specifically New York, in New York, my home state, there was a tremendous, tremendous argument over this. And in this ratification process, there was a willing ear extended by the Federalists. The promise of a Bill of Rights. And Madison agreed finally and gave a wonderful speech in June 8th of 1789 in the first session of Congress saying, we need to do this. We need to have this. So that's the second point, is the Bill of Rights was added. The Bill of Rights comes afterwards, but the Bill of Rights was added to guarantee these liberties. And the third thing is the Constitution can be revised. It can be changed. It's the most amazing, flexible document I've ever studied in my life. It can be revised. And so think of the revision of it. Women received the right to vote, 19th Amendment. It's a revision. Slavery's ended, 13th Amendment. It had this unbelievable flexibility. Let's say presidential elections. Well, we don't want all these Roosevelts running all the time and being more than 2 terms. 22nd Amendment, 2 terms. And so you put it in. Let me kind of move a little forward. I know the time's going long, but I want to throw my favorite guy in there, Lincoln. When you got to Lincoln, Lincoln looked back at all of this, okay, and the Civil War was coming up. And how else do you know it rests on the people? Because Lincoln looked at the Civil War and he said, well, I suppose if the states so decide to change or revise the Constitution, they may. However, they cannot do it without the people's consent. Lovely word. Now, what did he mean? Let's say I'm in a state like Alabama and I decide, in this sense, in this Alabamian state, there's a decision to secede from the Union. This was made by the Alabama state legislature through the counties. But let's say I'm in a county and we don't want to secede. How can you secede without the will of the people? And when you look at it, all of the problems of the Civil War are written large at the Constitutional Convention. The arguments over three-fifths compromise, slaves, the taxes, okay, right? Because if you want to count slaves, then you're going to tax them. Okay, if you want to count slaves for representation, then you're going to get taxed. And all this began. Right there, it's about this balance of power between the North and the South and short end. The other part of it that is written right there is the idea of secession. If a state was going to leave the Union, it could not do it without the will of the people. Ultimately, it rests with the people. States determined slavery. It wasn't national, it was state. Yet that was in a conflict. Which was more important, property or liberty? Liberty superseded property. And so with secession, when a state wanted to secede, Lincoln argued, they seceded, yet not with the consent, not appropriately. Okay, so anyway, hopefully that makes sense to you. If not, let me know. The Constitution and the necessity of it, you can argue. However, it brought unity to the American public. In a sense, it was our Constitution, and it was one of the most incredible creations ever in the history of mankind. It's unbelievable to fathom it in such a short document, Article 1, Article 2, Article 3. I didn't even get into the presidency. I apologize. And there's some good stories I'm not getting to you. But ultimately, the greater authority to the central government, yet the sovereignty remained with the people. And rightfully, it should always be. Let that always be true. It's a wonderful system. Okay, believe in it, cherish it. Elections, voting, isn't it wonderful? 2020, you get to elect, you get to vote. Only time when I'm sitting here with equality is my vote's equal to your vote. That's what I like to think. Okay, thank you. Bye bye. Take care.